All right, now this is a pretty important chapter, and I say that with, or portion of this chapter, and I say that in that it's really good information to know. I will tell you this is not going to be a big part of this coming test. It usually is on it, but I don't think we have time to really do it justice. I'm not saying to throw it out, but as we go through, I'll tell you the ones to definitely key in on. So let's begin. So cranial nerves. There are 12 pair of cranial nerves. They are nerves that come off the brain and brainstem. While most of them are mixed nerves, like all spinal nerves are mixed nerves, but in cranial nerves, there are some that are dedicated to solely be sensory. And then there's some that are primarily motor. So we have this mixed, we have sensory, and we have motor. Now, there's mnemonics, and usually they don't use M for mixed, they'll use a B for both. And so one of the things that you'll probably need to know at some point in time for sure is what each one of the cranial nerves is. Now, first, I guess I should really say you need to know Roman numerals. Roman numerals are very important, and they're pretty basic, but they don't get taught a lot. So just to let you know, that equals the number 1. That's a terrible drawing of 1, but you know what I'm doing. All right, so as you go along, this would be 2. All right, this would be 3. Now, 4 is kind of unique. So this V equals 5. And so what they would do to mark for 4 would be they would put a 1 in front of the 5. So it's saying you're taking 1 away from it. So then 5 again is the V. And then so 6 is V1. 7 is V with 2. 8 is going to be a 5, a V with 3. And then we get to 9. Now 9 is 1 before 10. So 10 is X. So as you go through, 9 is going to be 1 in front of an X. Then we get 10, which is just simply the X. Then X with 1 after it is 11. X with 2 after it is 12. And that's all you'd need to know here. But I want to tell you that a lot of hospitals, it's still standard for if you're doing any cranial nerve testing that they're listed in Roman numerals. So Roman numerals is something that's pretty big to understand. Just want to point that out there. You don't have to know about different things where they synapse and stuff like that. But we're going to go over the basics of these. This kind of gives you an idea where they're found. This area you study when you're looking at the skull. This is the cribriform plate is what these sit in, and as they extend down, there's little, as it shows on this side from the side, there's little receptors that extend down in there in the upper part, the most superior part of the nasal cavity for you to breathe. But anyway, just pointing that out, not a big deal. So we're going to go through some of these. Cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve. It is a sensory-only nerve. There's only 3 sensory-only nerves. This is one of them. It is associated with the sense of smell. It is the most basic of your senses, the sense of smell. Now again, this is goes through the cribriform plate, which we talked about. I'm not going to worry too much about that, but I want you to know cranial nerve 1 is sensory only, and it is for a sense of smell. And what you would do to test it is you just have the patient. Now, all of these, before we even get into this, all of these, if a patient comes in, you're going to have an idea of what the problem is. If someone has a problem with the olfactory nerve, they're coming in saying they can't smell. You should be able to kind of have an idea of what kind of things to look for. The way you test it is you have them sit with their eyes closed, and you have them occlude or close one nostril off to the side, not finger in. And you have them breathe normally. It's not huffing. They're just breathing in normally. And ask them to identify what they smell. You're going to hold something that's very recognizable coffee, vanilla, orange, something that peppermint, that they should be able to tell. And one of two things is going to happen. Either if they have a problem, one of them could be that there's a problem with the actual nerve, and that's going to be where they can't smell anything. And you test from side to side. The other one is if there's a problem with the brain and the area. This happens a lot with stroke victims, where they know they should recognize the smell, but they can't think of what it is. Right? But again, this isn't something I'm going to test you on. I'm just going over it. Number 2 is the optic nerve. Again, it is a sensory-only nerve, and hopefully everybody here knows it's with vision. This is not about whether you wear glasses or not. This is when you have true vision issues like peripheral blindness or tunnel vision. This is going to have major things that are going on. And so I'm just going to go through these as we go along. So sensory only. So the first 2 are sensory only. And again, like I said, there's only 3 sensory only ones. So cranial nerve 3, and I wish I should have put all these together. 3, 4, and 6 all work together. The one that doesn't, that's in the middle here, 5, is off on its own, and you're going to see, and it's a pretty big one. But all 3 of these, 3, 4, and 6, are motor only, or it says here primary motor. All 3 of these are designed to move your eye around the cardinal field. So again, this is drawing the eye. This is the little shaded part. Ooh. And so to move your eye in the different directions, up, down, and across, and to the side, these are working the muscles that do it. The first one, oculomotor, should be relatively easy to figure out. That's what it's doing. Oculo means eye, motor means movement. Trochlea, you might not be able to see. It is an interesting one in the fact that in the orbital socket here, so let's say this is medial, so I'm drawing a little. There is a little part on the bone that comes out like a little hinge, and so the eye is in here, and there is a muscle that attaches to the wall of the bone. It comes up, goes through that little hinge, and comes down and attaches. And it's called a trochlea. That means a pulley. And I drew it the wrong way. It actually would be over here and attach. So that when it pulls, it's going to pull the eye at an angle. It's pretty interesting how it works. You don't have to know any of this, just kind of pointing it out. Now I'm going to skip down to cranial nerve 6 to top. So cranial nerve 5 is the nerve that is in the middle of those, and it is a big nerve. As a matter of fact, it's the largest of the cranial nerves. It is a mixed nerve. This is the first one that has both sensory and motor. And you can kind of see, again, I'm not going to ask you really anything about this, but just it's good for you to understand. And these are basic, these actually have well-named parts. It's called the trigeminal because it's got 3 branches. Ophthalmic is going to go to the eye. You've got one that runs along the maxilla, and it's called the maxillary. Then you have one that runs along the mandible, and it's called the mandibular. Now, this is a very important nerve, and it is one that you can have some really serious problems with. There's something called trigeminal neuralgia. Trigeminal headaches are really bad headaches with this nerve. So anyway, this is called the trigeminal nerve. It is cranial nerve number 5. It is an important nerve. It's a big mixed nerve. Now, with all that this does, the way that this one is tested is mainly sensory. As you can see, it's sensory here, and sensory here. Now, this is, it's more than just sensory. It does have motor because it's mixed. But the way they test this is you would have the patient seated, have their eyes closed, and you would touch them in different areas. You want to do it in all 3 of the spots, that the 3 branches, and on either side, with like a Q-tip, and just have them tell the doctor when they feel the touch. It's pretty obvious, and people again will come in and they'll have, I've got numbness along my cheekbone. So that's general. Now, we talked about the abducens nerve, but this is the facial nerve now. So we skip from 5. Again, abducens works as the group with cranial nerve 3 and cranial nerve 4. But the facial nerve actually kind of works as a group with cranial nerve 5. The facial nerve is also a mixed nerve. It's got sensory to some of the taste, but it's tested by motor. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of a disease called Bell's palsy. Bell's palsy is a really sad disease where someone will have a paralysis of half their face. Bell's palsy is a problem with the facial nerve. So you test it by doing motor tests. You have the patient make faces, smile, frown, squint your eyes, scrunch up your face. And when someone has a problem with a area that's paralyzed or slightly paralyzed, it is really obvious when the other side is able to move and it's not. So the facial nerve, again, is a pretty big one. You'll see, again, it starts and has very similar areas of the trigeminal nerve. They're kind of a match set. This one, I do want you to know some stuff about because this is one of the ones of the models that you looked at in the lab, and so you should know the vestibulocochlear nerve. Now, there are mnemonics out there that you can look at, and a lot of them will use this either acoustic or auditory, which is the A portion of it. That is no longer an acceptable use. They've gotten away from that because it's a far more complicated thing than just the hearing part of it. So it is called the vestibulocochlear nerve. It is cranial nerve 8, all right, and it is sensory only. All right, it is the third of the 3 sensory-only nerves, and it has 2 branches. Not worried about you knowing the names of them. One of them you should kind of know. This vestibular branch, this is about equilibrium. So it's where in that model where you're looking at the semicircular canals that are in there, it's kind of working with that as well as that middle part. That middle part's called a vestibule. If you know anything about architecture, the entryway of something is a vestibule. That's why this is called the vestibular branch. Now this one, again, I'm not going to ask you about it, but you should kind of know this. Cochlear branch. This is where the sensory receptors for hearing are located. Now these are going to be mechanoreceptors. We will talk about that when I'm able to do the next video for the next chapter. But they're mechanoreceptors. They take pressure waves that are in the air and turn them to neuroreceptors. So this, again, is a sensory-only nerve. Cranial nerve 9 is glosso, which means tongue. Pharyngeal, which is basically the throat. This is a mixed nerve. It's sensory to the pharynx and tonsils and the posterior root part of the tongue, and it's motor for the salivary glands, and it moves the pharynx. This is tested by swallowing. Have someone swallow. If you've ever been to a retirement home or somewhere where you got elderly patients and you watch them eat, you'll see sometimes that when they go to swallow, they'll lean their head one way or the other, and they're trying to recruit other muscles to swallow, and that's generally because they're starting to have issues with this cranial nerve 9. Now, the next one we're going to see is the granddad. Cranial nerve 10. You definitely need to know about this one. Cranial nerve 10, it's called the vagus nerve. It is a mixed nerve. It goes through stuff. It's somatic, motor, first muscles of swallowing and speech and blah, blah, blah. A lot of stuff. But if you look over here, it controls the heart, the liver, the kidneys, the large intestines, the small intestines, the pancreas, the spleen, the stomach, your lungs. This is a huge nerve. As a matter of fact, we're going to look at the difference between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system is what is running your body under normal conditions. It's sometimes called the rest and digest nervous system, where the sympathetic is sometimes called the fight or flight. Well, the normal functioning nervous system, the parasympathetic, everything below the chin, the parasympathetic is run basically by the vagus nerve. In the next semester, you're going to get into different things like the circulatory system. And you're going to talk about how the parasympathetic and sympathetic have, these competing roles. Sympathetic's going to cause your heart to speed up. Again, you pass a cop and you don't know how fast you're going, your heart's going to start racing. but the parasympathetic slows it down. Same thing, kind of lungs. The sympathetic's going to increase it, stimulate it. The parasympathetic's going to lower it. And pretty much everything's going to be, antagonistic to each other between those two. The digestive system, the parasympathetic is going to be stimulatory, where the sympathetic is going to be inhibitory. But all of that is controlled by the vagus nerve. And that's going to be a pretty important thing. It's going to come up on several of the chapters next semester. When it talks about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system is basically the vagus nerve. And then the last two, the accessory nerve is sometimes called the spinal accessory. So some mnemonics you might see will have the S there, and that's fine. This one, these two are acceptable. I will tell you that I think since we're doing stuff online and everything goes through McGraw-Hill, this is the one they use. It's primary motor. It has two branches, cranial and the spinal branches there to the muscles of the back and the neck. And so if someone comes in, the way you test this is have them raise their shoulder. I'm going to go back to the vagus nerve here to end in just a second because I forgot some things. But the last one, cranial nerve 12, is the hypoglossal nerve. Hypo means below, glossal means tongue. And so it is primarily motor. It goes to the tongue. It is for speaking, chewing, and swallowing. If someone comes in with a problem with this, they're not going to be able to speak well. They're going to have, a hard time. Now, the way that you test this is have them stick their tongue out and move it around. Now, the vagus nerve, and I'm not going to go back to the last slide because of the fact that I don't know how all that works and I don't want to have to redo anything. But the vagus nerve, the most common area to have a heart attack is going to the bathroom, doing number 2, we'll just say. Most common place to have a heart attack. That's why all hospitals, all retirement homes have emergency call buttons right next to the commode. And it is because the vagus nerve controls the heart and the intestines and the anal sphincters. So if you're straining or something's going on, it can shut down your heart. And I always joke that the irony of all ironies is Elvis, who made his living in Vegas, died on the throne from the vagus nerve. So anyway, but that's one of the reasons why I want to stress how important it is. It is a big clinically significant one. And oddly enough, of all the things that it innervates, the way you test it, this is the tongue depressor, the open up and say ah, the little thing, the uvula that's in the back of the throat. When you say ah, it should raise straight up. If there's a lesion, it'll either go to one side or the other. And so that's a pretty interesting thing in my opinion. This last little section just shows a breakdown of these and gives an idea of what they are. So I'm going to tell you that 2 things that you will need to know is the name and the type. You'll need to know going forward, and again, this isn't going to be a big part of the test, but you'll need to know the cranial numbers, the Roman numerals, I should say, and the name for each one. And then whether it's sensory mixed, which should also, like I said, when you're doing mnemonics, it means both, and sensory mixed or motor. So there's plenty of cranial nerve mnemonics out there. I'm not going to tell you mine and they're pretty straightforward. Some of them can get pretty raunchy. I'm just telling you that if you have a test where you have to write down the cranial nerves and you have a mnemonic that you don't want your mom to read, don't put it on it and hand it in. So just one of those things, but I just wanted to kind of point these out. Again, not a big part of this test. It usually would be. I just don't feel we have time to cover it sufficiently. You do need to know optic and vestibulocochlear, 2 and 8. Those are ones that are on. You need to know them for lab. You do need to know vagus. The vagus nerve is a very important one. I would say, I doubt that there's anything going to be on it, but if I was looking, the next one down would be the 2, the cranial nerve 5, which is the trigeminal nerve, and cranial nerve 7, which is the facial nerve. Those are some, again, very clinically significant cranial nerves.